When it comes to the issue of gender, it would appear that the classical sociological theorists very much lacked any discussion of it. Most classical sociology tended to assume that the bulk of social action, or even social structure, revolve around men, and not so much about women, whose social position tended to be considered the home. Hence, there was a sort of division between the public and private spheres. And we also have something called emotional labor and the second shift. These will be concepts that will later explain that are relevant to the fact that women and men seem to be divided into the public and private spheres as though they are mutually exclusive. We're going to go through a long history of the way gender was conceptualized, starting out as gender being a set of roles defined according to people's biological sex or biological constitution. We're going to go through the history of how society's concepts of gender evolve over time from something fixed into something fluid. Of course, the original traditional view of gender could be traced even back to Durkheim, that gender differences rest fundamentally on biologically given distinctions between men and women, and that it presumes that women's social position and identity revolve entirely around their involvement in reproduction and child-rearing, and that men's roles, on the other hand, consisted of being active in the public spheres of politics, work, and war. Now, Marx, on the other hand, being a conflict theorist, did to some extent acknowledge that there were power divisions that, although he did not specifically refer to as being gender-based, he did mention a parallel in which gender differences in power and status between men and women also reflect other divisions, especially class divisions. So for Marx, the power of men over women only came about as class divisions appeared. So again, he blamed this on class divisions based on your relations to the means of production. And so women came to be a form of private property owned by men, especially through the social institution which we call marriage. So up until the late 1980s, classifications of people mostly were based on two main sexes, men and women. And the word they used at that time was the word sex, but later on there was a shift towards the word gender, because there was an acknowledgement that it's an identity created based on presumed biological rules. So to take an example, in the 1950s, if you look at the western part of the world, there was a saying that little girls are made of sugar and spice and everything nice. And if you look back into ads, especially some of these ads that are circulating on the internet, you look back at ads selling, say, equipment for cleaning households back in the 1950s, or domestic equipment, they tended to feature pictures of women being housewives and having to depend on their husbands to purchase things like vacuum cleaners for Christmas. And the housewives would look so happy and so ecstatic to be receiving some kind of tool which is for them to do house chores, especially on Christmas. And if you look at perhaps some of these advertisements also, where they're selling some other products which are not related at all to the concept of gender, you would see pictures like the husband spanking the wife because she forgot to buy his favorite brand of coffee, or something like that. And that was totally the norm in those days. So anyway, is there any escape from this fate, so to speak? So let us come to the definition or the demarcation between two terms here that were once upon a time used interchangeably, gender versus sex. So in biosocial terms, gender is not the same as sex, because gender refers to the psychological, social, cultural, and behavioral characteristics associated with being female or male. As you see again, the assumption is that it's binary, in which there's either female or male. And especially in the more conservative days or traditional days, whatever is defined as female was basically whatever is not defined as male. So it was a very antithetical kind of definition. And it was treated as a social fact, especially from a structural functionalist viewpoint, because we generally have two biological sexes that are needed to come together to reproduce so that society will continue to thrive and survive. And in order to do so effectively, there has to be two corresponding genders that play their roles. So if you recall, when we talk about the evolution of sociological theory, we've come all the way from the Enlightenment to classical sociological theory, to conflict theory perspective, the Frankfurt School, critical theory, and then we have structural functionalism, we have the individualist perspectives, and finally we came to post-structuralism and even post-modernity, in which there was postmodern social theory, which aimed to counter everything that the classical theorists said before. And of course, the entire assumption behind postmodern social theory was that there are no longer any boundaries anymore, because supposedly we have entered into the age which is after modernity, which is postmodernity. And therefore the same goes also for gender, because in that sense, gender too loses its constructs, loses its social factness about it. And if you look at examples today, there may be actors, actresses, and you have concepts like transgender, where people change their genders, either just conceptually or actually physically through operations. And there's a concept like date name, where a person may be born male or female, or what they call cisgender, and then they decide to change both their biological bodies as well as their gender roles. And then you have the term transgender to describe the situation. And in some parts of the world, you even have special pronouns to refer to people. It's not he or she or him or her, but you have like Z or they or oo or so many others. So one may say that, okay, perhaps it's post-structuralist or postmodern in some parts of the world, the Western part of the world, and not all Western countries, but maybe the more forward or industrialized ones. And this is certainly not the case in every country in the world. So therefore, gender has become something that's very questionable, malleable, and seemingly interchangeable as well. And so you even have a paradigm or a school of thought called intersectionality. This kind of relates to the fact where if you look at women as the oppressed, the female gender as the oppressed or marginalized gender, their experience of being oppressed within the gender dimension tends to also overlap with their experience of being oppressed through the racial or ethnic or social class dimensions. So that's why it's called intersectionality, because it crosses many sections. It intersects across many intersections. So again, just to go back to the definitions, if we talk about genetics, females are identified by having two X chromosomes and males are identified by having an X and a Y chromosome. So with that said, some feminist writers have argued, and feminists here mean those who believe in equal opportunities for men and women. So there are actually 7 types of feminism, and we'll come to that later. Feminist writers have argued that it's a mistake to suppose that either men or women are groups with their own interests or characteristics as a whole. For example, Judith Butler, who has been influenced by postmodern social theory, believes that gender is not a fixed category, but a fluid one, and it's exhibited in what people do rather than what they are. So again, it's very ethno-methodological, very phenomenological, and symbolic. If we perform our genders the way we want to, then that's the gender we aspire to. So for Butler, it's a very performative thing. And meanwhile, not to exclude the men, there's also something called a crisis of masculinity, according to Susan Faludi, who says that some groups of men are still confident in their gender roles and they still feel in control, but in a way, perhaps because they feel threatened by the rise of feminism, there are also some groups of men who find themselves marginalized and lacking in self-respect. So this is in turn related to the crisis in education, where there's a crisis of masculinity, because for some men, those who feel threatened by these social changes, like women being equal to them, and also there are also social changes or technological changes in the nature of work, Like again, if we recall the Marxian perspective of social change based on the mode of production, and with technology moving more towards IT, and as we know now, the fourth industrial revolution, perhaps there is a kind of digital divide as well. So that could be one of the reasons why we see more women than men in education. So with that said, there is also